Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final series of webinars on risk and resilience that we're holding for 2021. You'll be delighted to know we've already got a series that we're lining up for next year, but we thought we'd close the year by looking once again at some of our favourite topics, some covering risk, IT, lone working, hybrid working, and all topics that are really relevant to today's businesses. We've got Steve Fowler, who's joining me today. Steve is one of my senior risk professionals, one of my fellow risk professionals. Steve, like me, is a member of, in fact, you're a fellow, Steve, aren't you, of the International Institute of Risk and Safety Managers. You are a fellow, absolutely. A fellow of the RRSM, and what we're going to share with you today is just some of the slides, some of the content that we deliver with a course that we deliver through the RRSM called, unsurprisingly, Managing Risk. Before we kick off, though, just a few pieces of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so if you can't attend the whole session, or if you feel that the session would actually be relevant for other people, then it will be available from tomorrow and then on the website again next week. If you go to the website and look at the events page, you'll find that you've got a number of the webinars that we've recorded throughout the year, which are there for you to go back and listen to. Please ask questions as we go through. For those of you that haven't used GoToWebinar before, you'll see a pop-out box, and you can pop questions into that chat box or into the questions box, and we'll pick them up either as we go through or at the end of the session. A copy of these slides is available in the handout session, and as I say, please feel free to ask questions as we go through. So, Steve, without further ado, risk is a topic that we love, isn't it? We love risk. We do, yes, we do. Perhaps it's worthwhile just explaining why we love risk so much. And oh, that's not a great start, is it? There we go.
That's the black hole. Yeah.
That was the black hole, didn't it? I haven't even got a black hole slide. There we go. Managing risk, impact on objectives. So, Steve, explain to us what risk is.
Well, welcome everybody. You know, people always tell me that what you shouldn't do is on your first slide present people with loads and loads of words, but we've done this deliberately because the British Standards Institution and its international counterpart, the International Standards Organization, do have a global standard for risk management, ISO 31000, last revised 3 years ago, and we thought probably the best place to start would be to go to that august document and see what they say risk is all about, because we've all got our own view what risk might be, but the International Standards Organization say, and I'll say all this without pausing for breath, organizations of all types and sizes face internal and external factors and influences that make it uncertain whether and when they will achieve their objectives. The effect of this uncertainty has on an organization's objectives is risk. Nice snappy sentence. And for those who are paying attention, I did breathe a couple of times quickly in the middle of that. But we've highlighted what we think are the key words here. It's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So if we just stop on that for a moment, what do we mean by uncertainty? Surely that's the same as risk. Well, I'm here to say, well, possibly and possibly not. By uncertainty, we mean anything that can happen that's out of the ordinary, and that could be good stuff as well as bad stuff. It can be things that matter, but also things that don't matter. So if you're in the UK, it might rain today, and unless you're selling umbrellas, probably that's not going to have much of an impact on your business. For some people it will, but for most people it's just an uncertainty. It's not actually a risk. So the core difference between a risk and an uncertainty is a risk that really matters to your organization, to your business, or your organization if it's not a business. So, okay, that's quite a long, wordy version. Now this chap here, Dr. David Hilson, calls himself the risk doctor. I've always tried to find out from him why he calls himself the risk doctor, and it basically comes down to the fact that he reckons he looks like a doctor. I think he's taking quite an old-fashioned view, because most of my doctors don't look anything like him. And he's come up, the great thing about David is he's a risk consultant. He comes up with you know, alternative, much easier to understand definitions of things. So again, quite a long sentence here, but nowhere near as long as ISO's. Risk arises from interactions between objectives, what must happen, what you're trying to do in your organization, and uncertainty, what might happen. Therefore, and we've highlighted the keywords, risk is uncertainty that matters. And we really, at Risk Evolves, we really like that definition because it puts it into, what, just 5 words, what risk is all about. And the key thing to grasp is that it is positive as well as negative. If you think about how you use the word risk in everyday parlance, I guess in business, we tend to think, oh, that's a bit risky, something could go wrong there. And we tend to use it as a synonym for threat. But actually, in your personal life, if you're about to go off and do something, you might say, I'm going to take that risk. You know, I'm going to go and take that risk with the potential for some sort of reward at the end of it. So when we're talking about risk in our own lives, we tend to think about the reward side as well as the threat side. And it's always worth keeping those 2 aspects of risk in mind. For those who are interested in language, risk comes from the Italian word rischiare, which means to dare. So the Italians have got it right. It's just in this country, we don't always get it right. So that's a bit of theory. Yeah,
I think that, Steve, you picked up though, haven't you, that actually we all, not wishing to do ourselves out of a role here, but actually as human beings, we're all quite good at understanding risk, even in its really basic form. Do I cross the road? Where shall I cross the road? I'm going to look left, I'm going to look right, I'm going to look left again before I cross the road. So that's about understanding and having actions in place to manage and reduce the risk, isn't it? So as human beings, we actually know how to manage risk. I guess what we look for is how do we manage risk in a more structured way in a business environment.
Yeah. And let's think about it. If we're in business to achieve a reward. We're in business to take risks. And it always makes me despair when people come out and say, well, okay, we can't do that because that's too much of a risk, or we can't do that. Well, if you end up doing nothing, you end up going out of business. Plenty of examples that have done that.
So, Steve, do we need to take risk in order to evolve then? Just putting that out there.
Yeah, but let's take an example of a Midlands-based company from a few years ago. There was a firm that used to make prams called Silver Cross, and they used to make what my mother would call sit up and beg prams, great big things with, you know, chrome wheels and everything. And of course, the market was moving towards, I guess, what we call strollers these days, little fold-up prams. But they thought, no, we can't change what we do. We'll stick with what we do at the moment. They ended up going out of business.
Okay. So, Steve, we work with a number of companies, don't we, to identify risk. How are we going to help and understand how we're going to find risk within an organisation?
As if by magic, another slide appears. So we've got a couple of slides. That's a quote from the 1970s or 80s TV kids program called Mr. Ben. As if by magic, something appears.
As if by magic.
We've got a couple of slides on this. The thing about identification of risk is risk geeks could bore you to tears with all the different forms that you could use to identify risk. But actually, it's pretty straightforward. You know, when thinking about risk, there's 2 ways of thinking about risk. External risk, stuff that hits us from the outside world. And I'm thinking of of something like Brexit or COVID or sustainability, you know, areas that potentially can come in from the outside. And then the next slide when we come on to it, but we'll spend a bit of time on this one first. Internal risk, stuff that happens within our own organization. And there we're thinking about things like our lack of attention to protecting our data and our systems, or maybe not protecting our people at work, but those sorts of things. Anyway, let's just touch on PESTLE for a moment. This is a pretty common management tool, and it's an acronym, and it just stands for political, economic, societal, technical, legal, and environmental. It's to help us to remember that when we're looking at risk, let's look at all the risks that could affect our business. There is a a risk, there's a threat, that if we get risk management wrong, what we do is we end up doing what I call risk management by media. So we're driving to work in the morning, or if we're traveling by train, we're reading the news on the web or whatever, and we pick on the latest thing to happen, which could be Boris's speech on COVID yesterday, or it could be something on sustainability or something on cybercrime, and we just focus on that one. Now, the thing about risk management is, done right, it's done on a systematic basis. And this acronym, PESTLE, exists purely to help us think through, right, okay, apart from what's on the news, what else is there out there that potentially could affect our organisation, both in a positive way and a negative way? Pick on the last one on the list, environmental. A lot of companies are out there making money from sustainability. So risk isn't just negative, it's thinking about what might happen, but also how can we exploit that as a business. And we've given some examples here on the right side of the slide of areas that might, potential risks that might fit into each of those areas. So taking a systematic approach is what really matters.
Absolutely. And your point, Steve, there around the positives as well. We're covering it in other sessions as well. But when we look at the environmental, for example, we know there's absolutely positive risk, opportunity associated with organisations looking at what their environmental stature is, looking at what their ESG framework is, the environmental, the social and the governance society side of a business, isn't it? Because we already recognise that without companies embracing ESG, they're going to start excluding themselves from supply chain. So it's a good opportunity, isn't it, to review risks and not just to look at the downside, but just to say, okay, if we were to manage that risk, what's the upside of managing that risk effectively?
I mean, if we're thinking of an analogy to, what's happening with ESG or sustainability at the moment. If we go back, 150 years to carriage makers, there are plenty of firms around the world making carriages to be pulled along by horses. But it was one or two far-sighted firms in Germany that were the first to turn around and think, right, okay, we've now got Otto Diesel's diesel engine and Gottlieb Daimler's petrol engine. What can we do with those? How can we embrace that change in paradigm? I hate that word. Sounds vaguely American. To change the nature of our business and create a more sustainable business. So all we're going through now is the 21st century equivalent of that.
Absolutely. So we looked at the external risks, and external risk and external factors are really, really important. Should we have a quick look at internal as well, Steve?
Well, I think we should do. Right. Okay, so the second way of looking at risk is to look at risk internally. So what might happen within your organization? And again, there's an acronym for this, to look at the strengths and weaknesses of your organization and the opportunities and the threats. Now, commonplace approach is to think about strengths and opportunities when thinking about your business plan, and opportunities and threats are where risk management comes in. But it's important to grasp their point we made right at the very beginning. It's opportunities and threats, and when looking at risk, you should look at both of them. We haven't given a long list on this slide, but I mentioned a few earlier in terms of potential internal threats. The common ones are occupational safety and health, cybercrime, data and failure to look after data, areas like governance, areas, common things like protecting your building against, if you've got premises, against fire, against theft, and so on and so forth. But we have got a handout, haven't we, Helen?
We do indeed.
Yeah, and that gives a little bit more guidance on the sorts of areas you might be looking at when you're taking a systematic approach to identifying risks within your organization as well as out.
And similarly, Steve, you and I spent, when we did our last series of webinars back in September, we spent a little bit of time doing horizon scanning, didn't we, in terms of what are the 5 key risks that we thought could impact organisation, and that we were pulling out then risks that actually we're all kind of familiar with, but are we actually applying our knowledge and understanding those risks into our business? So we were looking at resource availability. We have a chronic skill shortage in the UK at the moment. We've only got to look at the threat of, lorry drivers not being able to deliver our Christmas turkeys into the supermarkets, for example. That's a risk. It may actually be an issue for some organisations. We looked at mental health as well, and we'll touch on that a little bit later today in terms of how we look after our workforce. But the mental health of our employees is really, really important. And I think, Steve, what you were rightly saying there is certainly as risk professionals, you and I do a lot of what we call horizon scanning, isn't it? We look to understand what's going on, not just within our own environment, but we look within our locality, we look within the UK, and we also look as well for input from much further afield on where risks may be coming from and where they're being generated. And when we do the course, we talk about exciting things, don't we, like black swans and grey rhinos and all sorts of different risk terminology, and to describe where risk can actually generate and come from.
I'm glad you mentioned those not those words, black swans and grey rhinos, but those words, horizon scanning, because again, where organisations get their risk management wrong is just to focus on what's happening today and to stick to their own organisation, maybe within your own sector. We're all busy, so it's only natural to do that. But it is worth spending a little bit of time looking at what's happening in the wider world. The great thing is there's loads of stuff available for free on the internet to help fill in the gaps in your knowledge. And if we don't have gaps in our knowledge, we're not learning. So we should all have gaps in our knowledge. It's a good thing to be able to learn something new every day. One of the new things that Helen and I learned earlier this week, Aviva, the insurance company, they put out something called their Risk Insights report, which is freely available through the web. And they talk about their view, as identified from their customers, of what the biggest risks are this year versus the year before. And you mentioned shortage of skilled workforce. Well, that's on their list as number 2. For those who are interested, number 1, the economy. I mean, we've been to hell and back over the last couple of years with Brexit and Covid, and we've got ESG looming on the horizon. So it's no surprise that the economy is number 1. Skilled workforce, you have to be, in a darkened room, locked in for the last couple of years, not to see the impact that we just don't have the people that we need to do the things need to be done. And number 3 was loss of reputation and brand. I'm sure there are probably 1 or 2 people in Parliament thinking about that at the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, we've got a link to that in the slides and in the handout, which you can find on the GoToWebinar pull-down menu there. So, Steve, let's just touch a little bit as well on probability and impact analysis. Now, this is where some people get a little bit scared, isn't it, of what's going on? Oh my God, how do I manage this? And we cover again this a little bit more, actually a lot more, don't we, in the course that we run with IRSM, and we also go into how you manage and treat risk. But do you want to just describe the difference between probability and impact, and how that then form together to help us with our risk understanding?
Well, geeky risk experts can make this much too complicated, but it's really very, very simple. For any risk, and let's remember that risk can be both an opportunity as well as a threat, there are 2 core components. One is how likely it is to happen, and that can be called probability or likelihood. They are basically the same thing. The second thing is what sort of impact will it have if it happens. That can also be referred to as severity. And for any risk, you can plot, the likelihood against the impact. And why would you want to do this? Well, the reason you want to do this, so say if you've drawn up a list of potential risks, potential threats, potential opportunities, you probably want to focus on those things that are most likely to happen, and those things that when they happen are going to have the biggest impact. So, potentially the most likely and the most severe are the place to start. And the ones that you maybe not spend much time or indeed any time on would be those risks that are unlikely to happen And even if they do happen, they won't have any impact on your objectives anyway, because that goes back to our definition of risk as being uncertainty that matters. If it's unlikely to happen, or it's not going to have a big impact, then it doesn't really matter. So it's a way of grading your risks. I'd just add in a couple of things that have maybe come to the fore through the COVID pandemic, which are not easily explained by pure probability and impact. The first one's speed of risk. I think we were all, hit by an express train really at the beginning of last year when COVID suddenly hit us. It didn't creep in, it just wasn't there one day, and the following day, every organisation in every sector around the world was hit by it. So there is really a third factor alongside probability and impact, which is speed of risk. How quickly something is going to happen. And increasingly risk people are thinking, right, maybe we should build that into our analysis of risk. Stuff that's going to happen quickly is more important to deal with. And we're seeing this with the environment at the moment. I actually studied chemistry at university many years ago with the intention of becoming an environmental scientist. And why didn't I do that? Well, nobody was interested. They thought I was a hippie. They thought I had no real use to society because the environment didn't really matter. Because business people were saying, well, okay, something happens with the environment, I have plenty of warning. We don't really need to spend much time on this stuff. How's that changed in the last, 40, 50 years? The way it's changed is that we can have a benign climate one day, and then the following day we get the 100-mile-an-hour wind come in. And just think about, what's happened in recent days with Storm Arwen and Storm Barra. We didn't used to see that sort of thing happening a few years ago. So speed of risk, the fact that climate change is happening much quicker, makes it a lot more important. The second point, second additional one, is complexity. And all I mean by that is risks, unfortunately, don't tend to happen on their own. They tend to happen in groups. Different things happen at the same time. An example of that from the pandemic is we had this novel virus hit us from China, but at the same time we had the risk of being dependent upon PPE being imported from China. So if we just had the virus, but we had no risk of the availability of PPE, it wouldn't have been as bad. But think back to the spring of last year, we had this situation where we couldn't protect ourselves from the virus because this second risk, the risk of not being able to get PPE because the whole world wanted it at the same time, is what really exacerbated the situation.
And that's an important point, isn't it, Steve, is when you've identified your risks, is to think about what would happen if some of them occur together. So, we can point to all sorts of different things. The chip shortage, for example, which is impacting so many different industries from automotive to IT. How would you manage that in your organisation if suddenly a supply chain was, if not cut off, but was severely impacted? What would be the impact to your business? So it can be a complicated area, isn't it? But I think we would always say, just make a start. Just make a start. Use the PEST or use a SWOT analysis to start extracting what those risks look like to your organisation. Start the discussion. Start having the conversation about what could impact your business both positively and negatively in the future. One of the things we've also collected here, if I move forward another slide, is where you can go for other sources of information. So as we've already signposted to a couple of times, we collaborate with the RRSM, the International Institute of Risk and Safety Managers, and we help and run a number of events with them, including a couple of training courses. One of the events, which is free to attend in January, I think it is, maybe February. We're doing two, in fact, with them in January and February, is a very specific course all around ISO and risk management. So that's looking at how you manage risks as required by the ISO standards. In terms of other places to go and look at what if you're a member of a trade association, or if you're a member of a membership organisation such as a Chamber of Commerce, for example, listen and look at the information they're putting out. There's lots of good information that comes out from these guys, and whilst it may not be pertinent immediately to your business, just think about how this might impact my business in the future, or how that may be advantageous to my business in the future. In terms of horizon scanning, cyber, I cannot be on calls like this and not mention the risk of cybercrime. Very sadly, cybercrime continues to be a massive issue for many businesses. And if anybody thinks that they are impervious to it, then we've got a number of sessions that we'll go through later. And in fact, we've actually got James Squire from Warwickshire Police hopefully joining us on the session at 11 o'clock to talk about current threats that they're seeing from our dear friend, the cyber criminal. And Steve's already mentioned some horizon scanning that we do as well. So we look at the Aviva report that came out just recently, and there's a link to that report, again, free to download. And then when Steve and I really geek out, we go to the World Economic Forum and read their global risk report, which can, I think it's fair to say, Steve, be a little bit depressing, can't it? So there is lots of good information out there. And again, that's free as well. Yeah. I'm also pleased to say as well that we've been given 50 licenses by an organisation called the Risk Dashboard. Guess what those guys do? And it's 50 free licenses to use if you want to do an analysis of your organisation. It works on very much a Q&A type basis. It gives you a framework where you can assess your organisation as being, extremely capable, or whether or not you're missing evidences. So, and that covers everything from health and safety, cyber, environmental, and goodness knows what else. If you're on the call and if you'd like to know more about that, then please contact us at the info@risk-evolves.it. Steve, we've actually had a question come in, and we pride ourselves normally on no jargon, and you and I have accidentally slipped into some jargon. More for us. Yeah. Questions come in. What does ESG stand for?
Right, I have to stop and think. To my mind, it means environmental, social, and governance. So
absolutely,
yeah, it's to be used interchangeably with sustainability. And I'll have to go and beat myself up after this webinar, because I always try and use the word sustainability. So there's a danger that when we're talking about sustainability or ESG, we just think about one element. So our government at the moment is thinking about the really important subject of climate change, but it's not the only show in town. There are other areas of sustainability, like looking after your stakeholders, your people. The social.
Definitely. And running a business well, making sure that you are making sure that your business is economically viable and so on. So yeah, ESG is a topic of a whole different conversation, and definitely we're going to have some more sessions on that in our next series of webinars later in 2022. So we're almost at the bottom of the half hour. If we've got any questions, now is a great time to put them into the chat. Steve, thank you very much for that really quick whistle-stop run through on risk management. It's a topic that we're really passionate about. Very happy to take questions outside of this. Before we close, just to let you know that there will be a feedback questionnaire when we close the session. We really are grateful for any feedback. Do you find it useful? Do we talk too much? Do you want to see something different? And on the something different, if there's any specific topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, then we are always open to suggestions. Our next series of quarterly webinars are going to be on the 17th of March, so there's a date for your diary, but we've got a number of other sessions as we run through the day. So our next session is at 11 o'clock, talking, as I say, all about hybrid working and what it means, which is really important given, of course, the announcement from the government last night that they want us to revert to working at home where possible. So we'll touch on some of the security issues that we've got on that. We're also going to do a little piece on keeping the team safe. So there's lots of different things we need to think about in terms of keeping people safe when they're working at home. We are going to cover as well IT suppliers. What do you know about your IT supplier? If you've got an outsourced IT provider, are they good, they bad, or are they downright ugly? And then finally, we're going to close the day with a whistle-stop update on what's going on in the world of data privacy. Again, another passionate topic that we're very passionate about at Risk-Evolves. We don't have any other questions in the chat box, Steve, but thank you very much for joining. We'll catch up, I'm sure, as we go through the day. But thank you very much for everybody for joining the session. Thank you. See you later.
Yeah. Bye all.